All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, guys, whenever you're watching this. So just a couple of things before we start. I'm working on grading the secondary sources right now. They will be done by Thursday, hopefully before, knock on wood. Uh, do not forget that your primary source assignment is due on Thursday. I'm recording this on Monday, so that is Monday the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th. So including today, 4 days. Um, with the questions, make sure that your questions are not something that is easily answerable from the source. So, for example, a question that probably isn't so good is something like going to the secondary source. Who are the three primary men in the source? So that would be Casement, that would be uh, Stanley, and that would be Conrad. So I'm not looking for something specific like that, but rather something that could potentially provoke discussion. So, for example, uh, why did Stanley stay with the Belgian Congo for so long, even if he was starting to go anti-slavery or something like that? So primary source due in on Thursday. Remember, for this class, outside of the research paper, you do not need to go to any outside sources other than what I'm providing you. So for the primary source, you just use the the two sources that I provide on the assignment. So to sorry, which reminds me that a week on Wednesday, depending on when you're watching this, it'll either be coming up, or if you watch this after Wednesday, it's last Wednesday. That is a week from Wednesday the 10th. That is the 17th of June. Your research paper is due. You should already, hopefully, again, knock on wood, be reading your sources, reading the articles or the books that you've selected for your sources, and starting to try to write your paper. I think that's everything for the announcements for this week. So let's give you guys an idea of what we're going to be looking at with this video and the next couple videos. Ooh, magic. All right, let's go to the slideshow. There we go. Let's go to the slideshow from current slide. There we are. So for this video and the next, we're going to look at China under the Ming and Qing dynasty. So 1400 to 1750. For this video, I'm going to be, quote, establishing the world according to China. So I'm going to be talking about the geographic position of China and sort of how geography sort of forced it to develop. But the majority of this video is going to be talking about the late traditional Chinese society. So the various social groups that make up Chinese society. In the next video, we're going to talk about, there we are, the state of Chinese politics in the Qing dynasty. Then in the two videos after that, we are going to be looking at Western intrusion into China, as well as the Taiping Rebellion. And so this week we should be getting to almost the 20th century, 1880s, 1890s. And then the last two videos for next week will be dealing with China pretty much prior to the Communist Revolution in 1949. Again, there's going to be a lot to go on next week. I am just going to sort of do not really surface level. I'm just going to do some highlights rather than go, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. So I don't want to bombard you guys with facts, but I want to provide you guys with some highlights. All right, that being said, let us establish the world according to China. So again, this will be right here. is going to be what we're primarily going to be talking about with this video. We're going to be looking at the geographic position of China. So I'm going to show you a map in a second and talk about it. Then we're going to talk about and focus primarily on late traditional Chinese society. And we're going to look at three major groups. We're going to look at the gentry, we're going to look at the peasants, and we're going to look at the merchants. So just to give you guys a game plan, an introduction, if this was an essay, of where we're going today. Ta-da, a map. So with looking at China, particularly during this period of the Qing period, and I'll talk about what I mean by the Qing period later on. We're looking for the Qing period about 1611 or so, 1600 to about 1911. The sort of Western opinion, the Western version, the Western ideal of China is China as a solid state. China as a unified empire. And hopefully, as you can see at this map, well, this idea of unification, at least from the outside, is kind of belied, kind of underwritten. Because if we look at it, I mean, we have large geographical plateaus, we have mountains, we have everything. So I mean, down here, for example, we have the Nanling Mountains. That kind of separates the provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi from the rest of China. We have the North China Plain, kind of separated from the northeast by these mountains here. We have this plateau here, the Yunnan Guizhou plateau, separated by the Hengduan Mountains and the Qingling Mountains. So, and even if we look further to the west, we have basins or large valleys separated by mountains. So this idea of a unified China is kind of goes by the wayside when you start looking at geography. I mean, think about it in Canadian terms. I mean, the example I always use is Newfoundland versus the rest of the country, and I apologize to any Newfies out there. We have this idea of a unified Canada, yet Newfies are a little different from the mainlanders on the basis of geography. To get away from the Newfies for a second, my own experience. I lived in the Arctic. I lived in the north. I lived in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, and I lived in Iqaluit before it became Nunavut. And I can tell you for a fact that Northerners see themselves differently than the rest of Canada. So the geographic differences belies this idea of unification under the entity of a China. And so the national identity is almost shaped by geographical barriers. So, for example, we have the Karakoram Mountains and the Himalayan Mountains separating China from South Asia. I mean, Mount Everest. It's in the Himalayas. The Himalayas are a very significant geographic obstacle. So that meant that the people on this side of the mountains developed differently from people on that side of the mountains, which also meant that China, or the entity of China, almost formed an us, China, versus them, the other mentality. So people on this side of the mountains were Chinese, us. People on the other side of the mountains were them, the other. Same thing down here. We have the there we go, the Red River. I blanked for a second on the name of the river, separating Indochina from China. We have the mountains on this side sort of separating China from everybody else. Also, don't forget, and a lot of people do forget this, on this side, over here in this area, we have the Gobi, G-O-B-I, desert. Gobi Desert in the north and in the west. We have mountains and more desert in the west. We have obviously the East China Sea over on this side, sort of separating China from the other, that is Japan. Even though the Korean Peninsula was a tributary, that is a subservient to China, the Korean culture developed differently from the Chinese culture, creating, again, an us versus them, China versus Korean, because of the Qing Mountains located right here. In the south, we have, I don't know if you've ever been to Southeast Asia, very densely forested with jungles, very significant geographical boundary. So China developed a very much a Sino-centric, a China-centric national identity, national view of itself. And this Sino-centric view, this China-centered, internally centered view, would be buttressed, would be held up by the tributary system that develops. So I mentioned Korea for years, for centuries, would be a tributary state, would be providing tribute, payment, respect to the various Chinese dynasties. For years, Vietnam, again prior to the French, would also on and off be a tributary state to the various dynasties in China. So this idea of a tributary system created a very much China's better, everybody else is bad, or not bad, lesser than China. So this gave a very much Sino-centric view. And then these empires, particularly in Korea and in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, they're going to emulate. They're going to take ideas from what's happening in China to sort of create their own political system. So the political system, the empire or the kingdom in Korea, the empire in Vietnam, will very much emulate, will very much take its cues from China. And so what this meant is that it meant, for lack of a better term, geography insulated, there we go, China from other empires, from other quote-unquote higher civilizations, so that China perceived itself to be the top dog, perceived itself to be the higher, the more civilized nation, the more civilized empire, which is kind of ironic when we're going to talk about the next video, when you have Britain, France, Western European powers come to China saying, hey, we are bringing civilization, we are bringing modernity to Asia. So it's kind of ironic. So that's the geographical position of China. Now I'll go back for a second. For the rest of the video, I'm going to be talking about late traditional Chinese society. I'm going to talk about the major social groups that make up Chinese society during late traditional China. So we're looking, again, roughly 1600 to about 1911. And in late in late traditional Chinese society, I'm going to look at three major groups. I'm going to look at the gentry, I'm going to look at the peasants, and I'm going to look at the merchants. So let's look at, well, let's talk about how society is set up first, the major social groups, before we talk about the first I want to talk about, the gentry. Now, going from the highest to the lowest classes, and compare this to what I talked about with respect to Europe. In Europe, you have the landholders, you have the nobility, you have the landholders, and then you basically have everybody else. And then the merchants come in between as a middle class. During the Industrial Revolution, merchants, commercial classes in Europe start rising and creating their own class. So in Europe, landholders, merchants, middle class of commercial, and then at the bottom, well, everybody else. What the Chinese would say, the peasants. In late traditional Chinese society, going from the top to the bottom, you have the gentry, that is the what the Europeans would refer to as the nobility, the elite, the upper class of Chinese society. So we have the gentry at the top, the middle class. What I mean by middle class is a class in the middle of everything, the cream of the Oreo sandwich, the Oreo cookie, that is traditional Chinese society, is the peasants. And then at the lower level would be the merchants, the commercial classes. So if we compare this to European society, the gentry and the elite, they're kind of in the same spot. The peasants make the middle class, whereas the peasants and everybody else make the lower classes in Europe. And then the merchants make the lower class in traditional Chinese society, whereas in Europe makes up the middle class. And this is based on productive capacity, what they produce for society. Now, the gentry is going to be at the top because the gentry produces government. So they're ranked, at least historians and those who have studied Chinese society rank them based on the productive capacity for society. There are no traditional rights, there are no obligations inherent within each class. There are, and we will talk about obligations when we talk about the peasants, there are some obligations, but not like we are used to, not like when we talked about Hobbes or talked about Locke. So the peasants don't have any obligations, don't have any inherent obligations to the gentry. The merchants don't have any inherent obligations to the gentry. But there are going to be some obligations, and we'll talk about that when we get to them. Now, there are going to be significant groups that fall outside of this order. Professional soldiers, for one, professional or a priest class for another. But we are going to just focus on these three groups, these three major social groups: gentry, peasants, merchants. There we are. So let us talk about the gentry. Now, with respect to the gentry, I'm going to talk about their importance, why are they important, and who made them up. And then I'm going to talk about this idea of an examination elite. And I'll explain more when I get there. Now, the importance of the gentry is that it's, well, whenever we look at any society, whether we look at Canadian society, Chinese society, Indian, South Asian society, European society, whenever we look at a society, whenever we study society, so any sociologists out there, I apologize. But when we study society, it's necessary to study the power structure within society. Who holds the power and at what level do they hold the power? And for Chinese society, it's necessary to study the power structure within the society because I feel it provides an insight to the social revolutions that we're going to be seeing in the 19th and the 20th century. So that's sort of why we're looking at Chinese society. That's why we're looking at the power structure. That's why we're looking at the gentry. Now, the gentry are important because, again, they're layered based on their productive capacity for society, and the gentry produce government. The gentry sort of help make up the official bureaucracy of society, and it's important. And we'll talk about the bureaucracy itself when we talk about the examination elite. But the gentry, the important, the elite at the city, at the town, at the local level is important because they help the official bureaucracy function efficiently. When we talk about the politics, the gentry and the bureaucracy are ideally will work hand in glove. And so the gentry, the local elite, the local landholders, they will provide certain tasks on the local level where the government does not or cannot provide it. The gentry will provide money or even tutors, Tutors, or establish schools for their local area. During times of crisis, if there is a poaching problem, where illegal hunting problem, for example, the gentry will help round up a militia to take care of that problem. Now, it's important that these tasks are undertaken by the gentry only when the government is unable to provide the necessary service. So they just don't automatically provide this service, but rather they step into the breach when this service is required. Now, what this means is that the gentry provide sort of a buffer zone between the general population, that is the peasants, and the lowest level of the government. So the gentry kind of is the social lubrication, for lack of a better term, between the lowest level of government and the majority of the population, the peasants. So who then composed the gentry class? Who made up the gentry class? Now, for historians, both Western and for historians of China, both from the West and Chinese themselves, it's this idea of this question of who composed gentry class is one of the thornier issues in Chinese history. And it's a thorny issue because the status of gentry is not an inherited status. So in Western European society, you have this idea of, well, the status you're born in is the status you die in. Your status is going to be inherited. In Chinese society, this social status is not an inherited status. This whole social structure that I'm going to be talking about, the gentry, the peasants, the merchants, is a fluid class structure where one is able to both rise and fall. So we have a fluid class structure overall because the status is not inherited. And what makes up the gentry class is both a local elite, local landholders, local elite, for lack of a better term, and an examination elite. And I'm going to talk about this examination elite in a second. And so, with regards to the gentry, there are two ways to enter this social class. You could either enter it through land, by either purchasing land, or maintaining your status by inheritance. Now, with land, I'm not talking just small plots of land. I'm talking large tracts, TRACTS, large areas of land. So these landholding elite, these landholding gentries, they are large-scale landholders. They're not just your local farmer who owns an acre and a half. And so you could either enter this social class of gentry through landholding or through scholarship or an examination system. So the gentry is important because, again, they provide social lubrication and they are the buffer zone, and they provide tasks, they provide services when the government is unable or unwilling to. So I've mentioned again and again this idea of an examination elite. So let's talk about it. Government. So in this period of Chinese history that we're talking about, civil service is often a first career choice. If given their druthers, people are going to want to work in the bureaucracy because there are rewards for civil service. It conferred prestige and status on the individual and family. It provides, well, I mean, working in government provides this for anybody. It provides power. And for many, the sole route to achieving at least a fraction of power is through entering the bureaucracy. And it provides wealth for the individual and for the family because there is a small official salary, but there are opportunities for skimming profits, for taking a small percentage. And it's accepted that some level of skimming, some level of personal wealth creation is expected. So I'm going to pause here for just a quick second. I will be right back with you. He's back. I do apologize for that quick little pause, although you guys wouldn't have seen it. I stepped away for a second. All right. So let's go back to our PowerPoint. So again, civil service is often the first career choice because it confers prestige, it confers status on the individual and the family. Think of what I mean by this. Think of it like your parents and they're bragging. I mean, for those of you who have siblings, you may have or cousins. I mean, that's another example. Parents brag, and they take prestige, they take pride from how their children are doing. So I mean, I have a cousin who is a lawyer, and my aunt, well, she's kind of modest, but I mean, she still takes pride out of the fact that my cousin is a lawyer. Same thing here. It confers prestige, it confers status on both the individual and the family. Members of the bureaucracy, civil service, will have some elements of power conferred upon them. Power at the lowest level up to the highest level. And as I said before the pause, access to wealth. I mean, there is a small official salary, but there are opportunities, and they were expected, or I should say, small small skimming, small palming of money was expected. But if you take through your position a large amount of money, that's frowned upon. So there is some corruption is acceptable, too much not acceptable. So there is wealth, but there are opportunities to skim profits. And to enter this civil service, to enter the bureaucracy, you need to basically undergo an examination process. Very similar to becoming a doctor, lawyer, whatever today. You need to be accredited, for lack of a better term. And there are 3 levels of exams. There we are. Sorry, just thought this was my only one. There are 3 levels of exams. There's a district exam, that is the lowest level. So if we were doing this in a Canadian context, we have a district exam or an exam at the level of Regina. We have the provincial exam or the exam to enter the bureaucracy at the level of Saskatchewan, the province. And we have the metropolitan exam, the capital exam, the exam to enter politics, enter the bureaucracy at the level of the capital, so Ottawa. I mean, can you imagine today if politicians had to take a civil service exam before they sat as an MP or an MLA? Now, these exams are difficult. It's generally difficult to pass all 3 exams. You're looking at the local level, the district level, about maybe 1 in 1,000, give or take, pass the exam. At the district level, maybe 1 in about 2,000, 2,500 exam takers. And at the metropolitan exam, at the highest level, only 1 in 6,000 exam takers pass all 3. So to enter into the bureaucracy, you have to pass your basic level exam, your district level. Then to go to the provincial level, you have to pass the provincial exam. Then to get to the metropolitan, the capital, you have to make sure you pass that exam. And the high number of exam failures did lead to situations of social unrest. And we're going to look at one in particular in another video, the Taiping Rebellion, where we have a combination of a failed examination student coming together with Western religion in the area. So we'll look at that, an example of that coming up. Now, the subject of the exams. Now, the subject of the exams are the so-called Confucian classics. Now, Confucius, back in the, I want to say just at or after the Warring States period. Fascinating. If you're interested in more Chinese history, I highly recommend the Warring, Warring States period. If you play video games, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. If you're into Total War, or there are a number of action-based games on Romance of the Three Kingdoms. I believe on YouTube there is a number of Chinese, a serial series. I almost called them a soap opera. They're kind of in that vein, but a serialized series of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Fascinating period in Chinese history. Getting back here, Confucius came out with a series of ethical documents and ethical treatises, ethical works. And a number of his students sort of expounded, sort of reflected, added on to his writing. So the idea is for the subject of the exams is to look back at the Confucian classics, because the idea is by studying ethics, one becomes ethical. So for those of you guys doing PPE, political science, philosophy, economics, the idea is by studying philosophy, you become philosophical. Same idea there. By studying ethics, one becomes ethical, and you want someone who's ethical in your bureaucracy. So that's one thing, going back to the classics. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So, going back to the key terms. I don't have it on there. Yeah, I have Confucius. Confucius. I do not have the next term on there, so I'm going to say it, I'm going to explain it, but it's not one of the key terms. Now, how you sit down and take an exam, you have to study the Confucian classics, Confucius, Mencius, others. Now, to write the exam, there is a particular writing style that you have to write your examination in, and it's called the eight-legged essay. 8, as in the number 8, E-I-G-H-T, the number after 7 and before 9, the 8-legged, as in bipedal, what you use to walk from point A to point B, your legs, an 8-legged essay. Now, the 8-legged essay is a particular writing style where each line had a required number of characters. So every line of text could only have a certain amount of characters, had a required amount of characters, and each line had to balance both the previous and the next line. So it either had to synthesize, go along with the previous line or the next line, or antithesis, go against the previous or the previous or the subsequent line. I mean, can you imagine, for those of you guys who wrote the for all of you out there, of my students who wrote the essay, for those of you who are just watching this for lack of a better term, shits and giggles, hi. For those of you, can you imagine though if you sit down, write an essay, and I, as a requirement, say you must have only 28, and I'm just using this as an example, you must only have 28 letters per line, and each line must mirror, either mirror or go with the line previous and subsequent. That would be mentally draining to you guys, because you always have to go back to both the line before and think ahead to the next line to figure out, okay, what the hell am I going to write? How can I write and have it make sense? And how can I show them that I'm an ethical person? Now, this is a mentally draining task. This is also a physically draining task. For the district level, for the lowest level, it could be a 2-day exam. Write for 8 hours straight without a break. Then you're done for the day, come back, write for another 8 hours. For the higher up, for the metropolitan exam, this could be potentially a week-long exam. So this is a very physically and a very mentally tasking examination for the students. And so once you pass the district exam, congratulations, you can enter the lowest level, metropolitan, and then, the district and the metropolitan. Passing the metropolitan exam, That's what really allows you to really enter the bureaucracy. So the district magistrates that we are going to talk about, these are men, and almost always men, who pass the metropolitan exam. So they're going to be the lowest level of the Chinese official bureaucracy. But passing any level, passing the district, passing the metropolitan, will allow you to enter the local or the district or the provincial levels of government, just not the dynastic, not the imperial bureaucracy. Now, to take this exam, anybody could take it, whether you're, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, anybody is eligible to take the exam. So the examination system is an open examination system. That being said, the subject is Confucian classics. So oftentimes, if you're poor, your town, your village will pool their money together to hire a tutor, to hire a teacher for one of the, or a couple of the most brightest, the students with the most potential, because entering into the bureaucracy confers status not just to the family, but to the community as a whole. There are a number of South Asian students, or a number of African students in this class. Oftentimes, coming to a Canadian university, coming to a North American university, is done through scholarships, is done through family support, is done through community support. Being an international student is a very expensive endeavor. That's kind of what this examination system is like. So even though it is an open system, even though technically anybody could take an exam, it's expensive to get somebody to teach. If you're in to use for those of you in Saskatchewan, to use a Saskatchewan term, if you're in White City, if you're in Balgony, if you're in outside of Saskatoon, there's a place called Clavet. Only 300 to 500 people in the hamlet. And if you're in a small community like that, you might have somebody who's bright, who has potential. You might have a number, but as an individual, you don't really have the financial wherewithal to give them the education that they deserve. But everybody coming together, community uplift, could provide the opportunity for that potential student. And think about that pressure that puts on a student. Not only does the community use their own money to provide you with scholarship, to provide you with education, but now basically, for lack of a better term, the hopes and dreams of the whole community are on your shoulders taking the exam. So if you screw up, your community threw away a large amount of money. That's a lot of mental pressure. That's a lot of physical pressure on students. So a fair amount of students, well, they could potentially wear down over time, and it's not good for their mental well-being. So that's a Gentry. So again, we're looking at both an examination elite and a local elite. You're looking at a fluid class system where people could either enter into or fall out through scholarship or through land. Um, and I talked about the examination elite, this idea of civil service, providing rewards, and how difficult these examinations can be. Which brings us to the world of the peasants. So we're shifting our view from the top level of the first major group, the world of the gentry. Now we're looking at the second major group, the world of the peasants. Sweet, sweet liquid refreshment. Now, with the world of the peasants, the reason that the peasants are the middle class, and I use the term middle class as in the class between the upper and the lower, is because, well, first and foremost, they make up 80 to 85% of the population. The peasants are going to make up 80 to 85% of the population. The gentry, maybe about 10-ish percent, 10 to 12%. And the commercial classes, although they will grow over time, you're looking at 5 to 8%, depending on the numbers you use. Now, so they not only make up the largest percentage of the population, but again, it's where their position is based on their productive capacity. So the peasants are going to produce two major things. They're going to produce agriculturally. They're going to basically feed China. But also they're going to produce the economic base of Chinese society. They are going to be the primary tax base in Chinese society, which means that they're pretty much the largest producers agriculturally as well as economically for China. Now, let's talk about the peasant village and this idea of a market economy. Now, I apologize, just one second. All right, I apologize for that. I had a sneeze coming up, and I'm sure you did not want me to, or you did not want to see me sneezing on camera. So the peasant village and the market community, we're going to start there first, talk about social relations, women, and then the peasant in Chinese history. The peasant village, I mean, typically you're looking at your typical peasant village, anywhere between 20 to 30 houses made up of mud and brick walls with a family per household. When you're thinking about families, do not think about a nuclear family. Oftentimes these families involved extended families as well. So your typical peasant village, 20 to 30 houses made up of mud and brick walls. Some of the larger villages could be made up of upwards of 80 houses. And in the peasant village, what you're looking at is somewhat similar to a European kind of village, where they work the land agriculturally. But rather than large concentrated plots of land like you would think of in a European village, in the Chinese peasant village, think of it more like an intense cultivation of small plots. So think of when they work the land in a Chinese village, think of it more as intensive gardening. Many of you guys, or I don't know, but for those of you who have lived in houses or lived in areas with a large backyard or even a front yard, think of about the size of a backyard or a front yard being worked agriculturally. That's about the size of the small plot that we're talking about, which meant that most farmers in the peasant village did not farm exclusively. They had to supplement their income because most of the agriculture that they did was subsistence agriculture. That is, it was more so agriculture geared towards feeding oneself and one's family, and then the extra would be sent to the market, which meant that most farmers had to supplement their income. So they had to have a second job. This could be like a blacksmith, or this could be a local artisan. But most farmers had a second job. They could work for the local gentry, as well as farming for their own use. Now, these peasant villages were centered around a market town. To give you guys an example, so I mean, in Saskatchewan, in Regina, the two sort of areas that come to mind, White City and Balgonie. So think of Regina sort of as a center hub, and or the market community. And this market community, in this case Regina, would be surrounded by satellite villages, these peasant villages within easy walking distance. So the peasant village would be centered around a market town or a market community where peasants could go and buy luxury goods in the market. And the different markets helping to tie the various villages together. So you might have family in a neighboring village. You come to the market community. You see, hey, that's my Aunt Diane. Haven't seen you in a while. How's my cousin going? How's everything? How's life in the other village? So it gives people an opportunity to rekindle connections. And the market community, as I said, would be ringed by these satellite peasant villages within easy walking distance. And the gentry, hello gentry, they would be located, they would generally live in the market town. So if school or education was required, the student would often go from the village community, the peasant village, to the market community and engage in learning there, for example. So the local gentry that's where they would grease the wheel, so to speak. But the market community would mark in some cases literally, it would mark the limits of a peasant's economic life or economic horizon. Your economic horizon is just your village and the market community. You don't see anything else. It marked the limits of your political horizon. You deal with the politics just in the market community. And sometimes it is the literal horizon for these peasants. It's literally as far as they ever go. I mean, it's like if for those of you who have lived in a small town, I've talked to students who lived in really small communities where Moose Jaw would be the big city, or Estevan in the south would be the big city, which would often mark the horizon of what their life is like. So that's sort of how they lived in the peasant village, how they worked, their sort of day-to-day life. So let's talk about social relations then. Let's talk about social relations. Now, within the world of the peasants, we have the influence of Confucian standards. And again, going back to Romance of the Three Kingdoms shortly afterwards with the ethics, And the ideals, the ethics, the ideas of Confucius taken as an ethical foundation was one way of bridging together disparate communities. Bridging together, going back to this map, communities in the Tibetan Plateau with the Northeastern Plain, with the North China Plain, with the Sichuan Basin. It's something that ties together these disparate communities. And one of the major emphases with Confucian ideals is this idea of obligation, this idea of ritual obligations, this idea of li, L-I. And for the peasants, you have the importance of ritual obligations, not just to their family, and we're going to talk about the family in a second, but to their community and further up. So there's responsibilities to the family, both living and dead. So that involves ritual obligations, responsibilities with funerals, with marriages, with religion, which we're going to be talking about in a second. Now, with this idea of ritual obligation, with this idea of li, L-I, we have this series of obligations not only to those above, but also to those below. And within the community, the family has an obligation to the community has an obligation to the family. The community has an obligation to the gentry, the merchant, the people in the market community. The gentry have an obligation to the peasant village. And the basis of these relations, the basis of these obligations is the absolute authority of the male head of household. The idea of father having the absolute authority in the family. That's on the family level. Take it out a little bit, the village elder or the village leader has absolute authority. Take it out another level. The market community, the gentry having absolute authority. Taking out further and further and further to the imperial level. The emperor has absolute authority. And this is backed by legal authority. This over centuries of social negotiation. This becomes legally binding. And so it's almost this idea of honor thy father taken to an absolute, well, not an absolute, taken to a more extreme level. And so you have to listen to the male head of household, who, if there's not a father, might be your brother, your older brother. And so this idea of ritual obligation permeates the social relations, and we will see this when we get to women, permeates the social relations within the world of the peasants. Now, within the social relations, we have popular religion. And so within the Chinese peasant cosmology, the Chinese peasant religious view, the other worlds, both heaven and hell, are replicas of the material plane, replicas of the world we live in today. And so I'm just paranoid for a second. I am recording. Yes, I am recording. I just had a moment where I was thinking, gee, am I just talking to myself? So again, The other worlds, heaven and hell, are replicas of this material world that we live in, which means there are celestial counterparts. So when your ancestors die, they enter into the other world, either the celestial world or the non-celestial world. And, well, the celestial bureaucracy, if the bureaucracy in the material world, if the bureaucracy in the world we live in is a bit much, well, the celestial bureaucracy, the celestial counterpart to the bureaucracy, is seen as too pervasive. It comes in everything. So in the material world, in the earthly world, it's a rather limited bureaucracy. The celestial bureaucracy is everywhere. And there are celestial counterparts to the bureaucracy. The lowest level of the celestial bureaucracy is in the house, known as the, quote, kitchen god. So this is the bureaucrat in the home. And the thing with bureaucracy is they are basically looking out and reporting everything up the chain of command that's either both good or bad. So, for example, if there was a kitchen god in my house, okay, Mark, the report back, Mark did a great job. He called his sister yesterday, who's in Vancouver, and said, and checked in to see that she was doing okay. Or a bad report could be, oh my God, Mark ate the last piece of chocolate cake that he could have shared and split with other people in the household. How dare Mark do that? So reports are always going up the chain of command. And these reports, both good and bad, could influence how the celestial bureaucracy engages with you on the family level and on the social level. So what this means is it's almost like you have a tattletale in the household. And so bribery is used to try to bribe these kitchen gods to ensure good reports to heaven. So the chocolate cake. I might take a piece of that chocolate cake and give it to the shrine, put it before the shrine of the kitchen god in my household, and basically say, look, I'm giving you a piece of chocolate cake. No need to tell anybody else that I had this last slice of cake. So this idea of the bureaucracy being everywhere is a means of social control. Not only do you have ethical ritual obligations from the Confucian classics, but also with popular religion, you also have this idea of good and bad reports being sent up the chain of command, which could positively or negatively affect you. So that's the peasant village and the market community. That's social relations. With respect to social relations, we have to talk about women. We have to talk about women in China. Because then, as in now, I should say, and this is starting to change in the modern era, but especially back then for the world of the peasants, women had a relatively low status overall, which tended to manifest during infancy. And this goes back to the idea of productive capacity. Because the pervasive feeling, and this is a very patriarchal society, is this idea that women tend to add very little productive capacity to the family. In fact, many within the household see a baby girl, the birth of a girl as a detriment to the family. Oh, this is just another mouth to feed. This is somebody who takes away from the amount of food that I'm bringing into the family. And so this manifests into a sexual imbalance in society between men and women. This is often due to poor care, poor nutrition, sometimes outright neglect of baby girls. So oftentimes women are just neglected in the family. Now, as they get older, as they enter their adulthood or on the way there, the productive capacity to women increases. And this is because of marriage. Because there's no other way to say this. As girls enter adulthood, their productive capacity manifests itself in their capability to produce children. And so marriage is often set up between families, not between individuals. So again, very patriarchal society. Your father will negotiate with the father of another family and say, congratulations, you are going to marry that son over there. So marriage is set up between families, not between individuals. And once a marriage is set up, once a marriage is consummated, the wife is sent to live with the husband's family. They do not go and build their own house and create their own family, but at least early on, but rather the wife is sent to live with the husband's family, which meant not only, at least early on in the marriage before any children, not only does the lack of productive capacity shift from the original family to now the husband's family, but the wife often had to suffer under a often demanding mother-in-law. This is not how we cook the rice. This is not how dare you do it this way. You must treat my son better. You are a bad wife. You're a bad you're a bad person. You're doing everything wrong. Let me teach you how to do it right. Type of mother-in-law. The wife will only gain status within her new family by producing a male heir, a male son. Now, there are grounds for divorce within Chinese society. Unfortunately for women, there are only two grounds for divorce. Physical violence, that is outright mutilation of the woman, so scarring or physical mutilation of the wife, basically, and for Chinese society, an outward showing that the obligation between the husband and the wife has been rent asunder. The husband is not doing his official, is not doing right by his wife. And the other is, well, there's no other way to say this, but the wife being forced to perform sexual acts on others. Husband can go out and do his own thing, but the wife being, quote, forced to perform sexual acts on others, that should read as adultery, effectively. Only on the side of the wife, however, not on the side of the husband. So women can get out of marriage. Women can divorce their husbands, but only under those two grounds. All right, I know I'm talking a lot. We'll just finish up with the world of the peasants. Then we will talk about merchants. And you know what? We'll just, for this video, we will just finish up with the peasants. And then we will shift our view to the merchants starting in the next video. So let's talk about peasants in Chinese society, because peasants play a considerable role in Chinese society. Again, in normal times, peasants are the middle class because they are the bedrock of society. Society is based on the foundation of the peasantry and farming. Peasants are the chief tax base. Peasants are the producers of agriculture for society. So during normal times, they provide land taxes, and land taxes are the chief source of revenue for the imperial government. Officially, you're looking at a tax of anywhere between 5 to 10% of a peasant's income. Unofficially, I talked about the gentry and the civil service. There are often a number of informal taxes, informal charges to support the locality, as well as to line local officials' pockets. So there are a number of unofficial taxes to help support the market community, for example. One of the big things that during normal times that the peasants play in Chinese society is the role of corvée labor. C-O-R-V-E, accent aigu, E, labor. And what this is conscripted labor from the peasant class. So the peasants some peasants are gathered together by the gentry, and they are told, okay, we are going out to work on the levee of the river so it doesn't overflow during the next spring rain. Or we are going to help repair the roads that were washed out by a flood. So this is conscripted labor from the peasant class, often used for public works projects. Now, there was also what we know as tenant farming, where somebody rents land from the gentry, rents land from an estate holder, and well, I mean the rent is paid directly to the estate holder, often 50 to 60% of the income from that land, and then you add on the 5 to 10% land tax. Why do people do this? Well, this is a way to increase your income. Even if you're paying, let's say, 55 to 70% of your income, you're still making more money than if you had that small plot of land. And land could be bought and sold. So unlike what we saw with permanent settlement in South Asia, peasants are not legally bound to the land. They are not legally bound to the land. So that's during normal times. That's everything's hunky-dory. Well, what about during abnormal times? Well, peasants, if during normal times, they are the bedrock for Chinese society. During abnormal times, they're the bedrock for Chinese society as well. In this case, they're the bedrock for rebellions. Peasant rebellions are generally led by failed gentry, often those who are failed examination candidates. And these rebellions could either be cultivated, where somebody goes out and riles up the local peasant population, or they could be spontaneous. It could be a spontaneous uprising against paying too much taxes during times of drought, for example. And for the minor ones, oftentimes they are very localized based on local conditions. For major rebellions, however, oftentimes they are ideologically sanctioned, and they're sanctioned on, and I know we're going to talk about this when we talk about the dynastic cycle in the next video. But it's often based on a shifting idea of the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven is simply this. Hobbes would love this idea that the celestial bureaucracy, the celestial emperor, basically says to this dynasty, you have the right to rule. And again, I will talk more about it in the next video, but ideologically, the peasant or the uprising claims that the mantle of rule is shifting from one dynasty to the next. And the rebels, as they are often viewed as, believe themselves to be the vanguard of a new era. And so oftentimes these major rebellions come from a loss of confidence in the dynasty, which often prove to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. All right, so I know I talked a lot in this video, so again, I'm going to stop the video here. We're going to pick up with merchants and artisans in Chinese society in the next video. So let's stop sharing. You see my face. So yeah, I'm going to stop here and we will pick up with the merchants in the next video. So good luck on your writing. Go forth and slay dragons. Talk to you guys later. Bye.